Imagine you're looking at a map of the Caribbean in 1715. Start at the top. The American colonies stretched down the eastern seaboard from Boston to Charleston. Now trace your finger south past the sandy barrier islands of the Carolinas, around the tip of Florida, where the Gulf Stream pushes warm water north at 4 knots, and out into the Bahamas. 700 islands scattered across 100,000 square miles of shallow turquoise water. Keep going. Southeast to Hispaniola and Puerto Rico, the gateway to the inner Caribbean. Then the long arc of the Lesser Antilles, Barbados, Martinique, Guadeloupe, curving down toward the coast of South America. And to the west, Jamaica and Cuba, sitting like two massive gateposts on either side of the Windward Passage. Now follow the trade routes. Spanish treasure fleets hauling silver and gold from Portobello and Veracruz, sailing north through the Florida Straits, where the channel narrows to just 90 miles between Cuba and the Keys. British merchant ships loaded with sugar, molasses, and rum from Barbados and Jamaica, heading north to New England. French vessels carrying tobacco and indigo from Martinique, Dutch traders running between Curaçao and New Amsterdam. Every single one of those routes passes through the same narrow channels, the same island chains, the same choke points, where the water turns from deep Atlantic blue to shallow turquoise green. Now picture hundreds of fast, armed ships hiding in those channels. Crewed by men who knew every reef, every sandbar, every hidden cove where a shallow draft sloop could tuck behind a mangrove island and disappear in minutes. Men with nothing to lose and everything to take. That was the Golden Age of Piracy. For nearly 3 decades, pirates turned the Caribbean into the most dangerous stretch of ocean on Earth. They captured thousands of ships, built their own republic in the Bahamas, and made the most powerful navies in the world look completely helpless. And then it ended. Not slowly, not gradually. It collapsed in less than a decade. The pirates who had terrorized an entire hemisphere were hunted down, hanged, shot, or forced into surrender one by one. The reason? A new kind of weapon appeared on the water. Not a cannon, not a musket, something much bigger. The Royal Navy warship, a floating fortress carrying more firepower than most colonial towns. Too heavily armed to fight, too fast to outrun, and crewed by men who were paid, fed, and ordered to kill pirates on sight. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. This is the story of how a handful of massive warships crushed the most notorious pirates who ever lived, and ended an entire era of history in the process. To understand why warships mattered so much, you first have to understand why pirates existed in the first place. And that story starts with a war. The War of the Spanish Succession lasted from 1701 to 1714. Basically, every major European power picked a side, and for 13 years they fought over who would sit on the Spanish throne. But the real action wasn't in European palaces. It was on the ocean. England, France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic all hired private ships to attack enemy merchant vessels. These were called privateers, legally sanctioned pirates, if you want to think of it that way. They got a letter from the crown, called a letter of marque, that said, go attack enemy ships and keep a share of whatever you steal. For over a decade, thousands of sailors made a very good living doing exactly that. They learned how to board ships, how to fight at sea, how to navigate the Caribbean with their eyes closed. They became experts in gunnery, in reading the wind, in knowing which merchant routes were fat with cargo at which times of year. They were trained, experienced, violent, and very comfortable with taking things that didn't belong to them. Then the war ended. The Treaty of Utrecht was signed in 1713, and suddenly those letters of marque were worthless. Overnight, thousands of skilled sailors were out of work. The Royal Navy downsized from nearly 50,000 men to around 13,000. Merchant fleets didn't need extra protection anymore, so they cut crew. Port towns across the Caribbean and the American colonies were flooded with men who had one very specific skill set and absolutely no legal way to use it. No pension, no severance, no gratitude from the crown that had sent them to fight in the first place. These men had two choices: starve on shore or go back to doing the only thing they knew how to do. So they used it illegally. Between 1714 and 1718, the number of active pirate crews in the Atlantic and Caribbean exploded. By some estimates, there were over 2,000 pirates operating at the peak. Former privateers like Benjamin Hornigold, Henry Jennings, and Charles Vane didn't even bother pretending to go straight. They just kept doing what they'd been doing during the war, except now they attacked everyone, not just enemy ships. And the Caribbean was the perfect place to do it. The geography was practically designed for piracy. Thousands of islands, shallow reefs that large warships couldn't cross, hidden bays where you could careen a ship and scrape the barnacles off the hull without anyone knowing you were there. And right in the middle of it all, the busiest trade routes on Earth: Spanish treasure fleets, British sugar ships, French merchantmen, Dutch traders, all of them fat, slow, and poorly defended. The pirates didn't need a navy. They needed speed, surprise, and local knowledge. And they had all three. Their ships were perfect for the job. Most pirates sailed sloops or brigantines, small, fast, shallow draft vessels that could carry maybe 60 to 100 men and a dozen cannons. What they lacked in firepower, they made up for in agility. A pirate sloop could sail circles around a heavy merchant ship. It could slip into inlets where the water was barely 6 feet deep. It could run before the wind at 12 knots with a skeleton crew. And when a pirate spotted a prize, the chase was usually over before it started. Here's how a typical pirate attack worked. A sloop would spot a merchant vessel on the horizon. The pirates would raise a friendly flag, maybe British or Dutch depending on what the target was flying, and close the distance. At maybe 300 yards, they'd run up the black flag, the Jolly Roger. That flag didn't just mean we're pirates. It meant surrender now and nobody dies. Most merchant captains took the deal. Fighting back against a crew of 60 armed, battle-hardened ex-privateers was suicide. The pirates would board, take what they wanted, sometimes take the ship itself, and disappear. The whole thing might take an hour. By the time anyone heard about the attack, the pirates were 200 miles away. And where did they go? Nassau. By 1716, the island of New Providence in the Bahamas had become a full-blown pirate republic. Nassau wasn't just a hideout. It was a functioning port town run entirely by pirates. There was no governor, no law, no customs house, no taxes. Just taverns, markets, brothels, and hundreds of armed men spending stolen gold as fast as they could take it. Benjamin Hornigold was something like the unofficial mayor. Blackbeard operated out of there. So did Charles Vane, Jack Rackham, and dozens of lesser-known captains. The whole economy revolved around stolen goods. Merchants from the colonies would sail into Nassau, knowing full well they were buying stolen merchandise because it was cheaper than buying through legitimate channels. Silks from China, sugar from Jamaica, tobacco from Virginia. You could buy it all in Nassau at a fraction of the market price, and nobody asked where it came from. The harbor at Nassau was perfect. Shallow enough that no large warship could enter without running aground on the sandbar that stretched across the mouth of the channel. Protected by reefs and a narrow approach that made a naval assault nearly impossible. The old fort on the hill overlooking the harbor was manned by pirates who kept watch for any approaching sails. And the island was located right on the shipping lanes between the American colonies and the Caribbean. Pirates could sail out in the morning, grab a prize on the open water, and be back in Nassau drinking rum by sunset. For the British Empire, this was a catastrophe. Not a military one, an economic one. Maritime insurance rates skyrocketed. Merchants refused to sail certain routes. Colonial governors were writing frantic letters back to London, begging for protection. The sugar trade, the slave trade, the tobacco trade, all of them were hemorrhaging money because of pirate attacks. And here's the part that really made London nervous. Pirates were getting bolder. Blackbeard blockaded the port of Charleston, South Carolina, in May of 1718. He captured 9 ships in a week, took hostages from some of the most prominent families in the colony, and demanded a chest of medicine as ransom. He got it. A pirate held an entire colonial port hostage, and the government paid up. Bartholomew Roberts, who wouldn't start his career for another year, would eventually capture over 400 ships. 400. That's not a pirate. That's a one-man navy. Something had to change, and it did. The British Crown decided that the Golden Age of Piracy was going to end, not through negotiation, not through compromise, through overwhelming force. The first move was political. In September 1717, King George I issued a royal proclamation offering a full pardon to any pirate who surrendered before September 1718. It was called the King's Pardon, and it was a brilliant piece of strategy. The idea was simple: split the pirates, offer the ones who were tired of running a way out, and isolate the ones who refused. The second move was Woodes Rogers. Rogers was a former privateer himself. He'd sailed around the world between 1708 and 1711, captured Spanish treasure ships off the coast of Ecuador, and rescued Alexander Selkirk, the real-life castaway who inspired Daniel Defoe to write Robinson Crusoe. During the circumnavigation, he'd lost his brother to a Spanish musket ball and taken a shot to the jaw himself that left him permanently disfigured. He was tough, smart, ruthless when he needed to be, and he understood pirates because he'd essentially been one. In 1718, the Crown appointed him the first royal governor of the Bahamas and gave him a small fleet to take Nassau back. His personal motto was "Piracy expelled, commerce restored." He meant it. Rogers arrived in Nassau Harbor in July 1718 with 3 warships: HMS Milford, HMS Rose, and HMS Shark, plus a few smaller vessels and transports carrying soldiers. The Milford was a 5th-rate warship, carrying 32 guns. That might not sound like much compared to the great ships of the line that fought at Trafalgar decades later, but compared to a pirate sloop with 12 cannons and a crew held together by rum and grudges, it was a floating apocalypse. The Milford alone could fire a broadside that weighed more than everything a pirate sloop carried combined. Most of the pirates in Nassau took one look at those warships and accepted the pardon. Benjamin Hornigold, the man who had essentially built the pirate republic, surrendered immediately. So did hundreds of others. They signed their names, swore to give up piracy, and walked away free men. Hornigold even switched sides completely and became a pirate hunter working for Rogers. But not everyone surrendered. Charles Vane was anchored in the harbor when Rogers arrived. Instead of accepting the pardon, Vane loaded a captured French prize ship with explosives, set it on fire, and sent it drifting toward the Royal Navy fleet as a distraction. While the warships scrambled to avoid the fireship, Vane slipped out of the harbor and escaped into open water. It was audacious, it was reckless, and it was the last act of defiance Nassau would ever see. Rogers took control of the island, rebuilt the fort, established a colonial government, and turned Nassau from a pirate republic into a British colony. Just like that, the pirates lost their home base. But taking Nassau was only the beginning. The real work was hunting down the pirates who refused to come in from the cold, and for that, the Crown needed warships. Here's what made a Royal Navy warship so different from anything the pirates had: size, firepower, crew, discipline, supply chain, everything. Take a 5th-rate frigate like HMS Pearl. She carried 40 guns arranged on 2 decks, 18-pounders on the lower gun deck, 9-pounders on the upper. Her crew was around 200 men, all trained, all drilled in gunnery and seamanship, all operating under naval discipline with a clear chain of command. She could carry enough supplies for months at sea: provisions, water casks, salt beef, gunpowder, spare canvas, timber for repairs. Her hull was built from English oak, thick enough to absorb cannon fire that would splinter a pirate sloop into driftwood. And she was fast. Not sloop fast, but fast enough to chase down most pirate vessels on the open ocean, especially if the wind was right and her copper-sheathed bottom was clean. The difference in firepower was almost absurd. A pirate sloop might carry 12 cannons, maybe 6 on each side, firing 4-pound or 6-pound balls. A single broadside from HMS Pearl weighed over 150 pounds of iron. That's enough to punch holes through a sloop's hull below the waterline and sink it in minutes. Now scale that up. A fourth-rate ship carried 50 to 60 guns. A third-rate carried 70. These were floating cities of war. Hundreds of men, tons of gunpowder. Cannons that could fire 24-pound iron balls through 3 feet of solid oak at half a mile. Their hulls were so thick and heavy that pirate cannons might as well have been throwing rocks. A pirate captain looking at one of these things through his spyglass had exactly 3 options: run, surrender, or die. Most ran, but running only works when you have somewhere to go. And after Nassau fell, the pirates were running out of places to hide. The Royal Navy's strategy was methodical and relentless. They stationed warships at the major choke points across the Caribbean and the Atlantic. They patrolled the shipping lanes. They established networks of informants in port towns. And they gave their captains a simple standing order: find pirates, destroy them. Lieutenant Robert Maynard was one of those captains. In November 1718, just 4 months after Rogers took Nassau, Maynard was sent to find Edward Teach, Blackbeard. Blackbeard had been terrorizing the Atlantic coast for over a year. After leaving Nassau, he'd operated out of North Carolina, where the corrupt Governor Charles Eden essentially gave him a safe harbor in exchange for a share of the loot. Eden even presided over a fake trial to declare Blackbeard's stolen goods legitimate salvage. It was an open secret that the governor of North Carolina was in business with the most wanted pirate in the Western Hemisphere. But the neighboring colony of Virginia had had enough. Governor Alexander Spotswood decided to act without waiting for London's permission. Blackbeard anchored his ship, the Adventure, at Ocracoke Inlet on the Outer Banks, a shallow, treacherous stretch of water guarded by shifting sandbars and unpredictable tidal currents. He thought no naval vessel could navigate it. He thought he was untouchable out there, surrounded by water barely deep enough to float a longboat. He was almost right. Maynard sailed south from Virginia with 2 small sloops, HMS Jane and HMS Ranger. These weren't warships in the traditional sense. They were small, lightly armed vessels that could navigate the shallow waters around Ocracoke, deliberately chosen for their shallow draft. But they carried something Blackbeard didn't expect: trained Royal Navy sailors hiding below decks, armed to the teeth, waiting. On the morning of the 22nd of November 1718, Maynard's sloops entered Ocracoke Inlet at first light. The approach was treacherous. Both sloops ran aground on sandbars before they even reached Blackbeard. But Maynard got the Jane free, and the fight was on. Blackbeard spotted them immediately. He had maybe 25 men aboard the Adventure, most of them drunk or hungover from a night of heavy drinking with a trading captain who'd visited the day before. But Blackbeard didn't run. He never ran. He reportedly shouted across the water, daring Maynard to come alongside. The first exchange of fire was devastating. Blackbeard's cannons raked the Jane with grape shot, killing or wounding over a third of Maynard's visible crew. It looked like a slaughter. Blackbeard pulled alongside, saw bodies scattered across the deck, and ordered his men to board. That's when Maynard sprang the trap. The sailors hiding below decks surged up through the hatches, armed with swords and pistols. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. but it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. Blackbeard found himself outnumbered and surrounded on the deck of the Jane. What followed was one of the most brutal hand-to-hand fights in naval history. Blackbeard fought like a man who knew he was going to die and didn't care. According to Maynard's own report, Teach received 5 musket ball wounds and over 20 sword cuts before he finally dropped. They cut off his head and hung it from the bowsprit of the Jane as proof. The most feared pirate in the Atlantic was dead, and the message was clear. The Royal Navy was coming for all of them. Over the next 4 years, that message was delivered again and again. Charles Vane, the man who'd escaped Nassau with a fireship, was eventually captured in the Bay of Honduras. He'd been shipwrecked, marooned, and picked up by a passing vessel whose captain recognized him. Vane was taken to Jamaica, tried for piracy, and hanged at Gallows Point in Port Royal in March 1721. His body was left hanging in a gibbet at Gun Cay as a warning to any sailor who might consider going on the account. Calico Jack Rackham, who had taken over Vane's crew after a mutiny, was captured off the western coast of Jamaica in October 1720. A pirate-hunting sloop sent by Governor Nicholas Laws caught Rackham's crew anchored and drunk. Most of them didn't even fight back. The 2 people who did fight were Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the 2 most famous female pirates in history, who reportedly cursed their male crewmates for cowardice while swinging cutlasses on deck. Rackham was hanged in November 1720. His body was displayed in an iron cage at a small island near Port Royal that's still called Rackham's Cay today. Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate who'd given up a comfortable plantation life in Barbados to become a pirate, was captured by Colonel William Rhett near the mouth of the Cape Fear River in September 1718. Bonnet had no real sailing experience and had essentially bought his way into piracy. The Royal Navy didn't even need a warship to take him. Rhett cornered Bonnet's ship in a creek and waited for the tide to go out. When the water dropped, both ships were grounded, but Rhett's vessels refloated first. Bonnet surrendered. He was hanged in Charleston in December 1718, but the biggest target was still out there: Bartholomew Roberts. Roberts was, by any measure, the most successful pirate of the Golden Age. Between 1719 and 1722, he captured over 400 ships across the Caribbean, the American coast, and the west coast of Africa. He operated with a fleet of multiple vessels, sometimes commanding crews of 300 or more men. He wrote his own articles of piracy, a kind of pirate constitution that governed everything from the distribution of loot to bedtime curfews to compensation for injuries suffered in battle. Lose a right arm, you got 600 pieces of 8. Lose an eye, 100. He had rules about keeping weapons clean, settling disputes, and lights out by 8 at night. Roberts, dressed in crimson silk damask, wore a diamond-studded gold cross around his neck that he'd stolen from the Portuguese viceroy, and carried 2 pistols on a silk sling over his shoulders. He drank nothing but tea. He was reportedly the most disciplined and tactical pirate commander of his era, and unlike many pirates who fell apart after a few months of success, Roberts ran his operation like a business for nearly 3 years straight. Roberts was also the reason the Royal Navy pulled out its biggest weapon. HMS Swallow was a 50-gun, 4th-rate man of war. She was one of the largest warships ever sent specifically to hunt pirates. Her captain, Challoner Ogle, had been tracking Roberts for months along the coast of West Africa. Roberts had been raiding slave ships and merchant vessels with impunity, and the Royal African Company was losing a fortune. In February 1722, Ogle found Roberts anchored at Cape Lopez off the coast of present-day Gabon. Roberts had 3 ships under his command: the Royal Fortune, the Great Ranger, and the Little Ranger. His crew was well-armed and experienced. By any normal calculation, Roberts should have put up a serious fight. But Ogle was patient. He drew the Great Ranger away from the fleet by sailing the Swallow past the Cape as if she were a merchant vessel. The Great Ranger gave chase, thinking she'd found easy prey. Once the Ranger was out of sight of Roberts's fleet, Ogle turned the Swallow around, ran out his 50 guns, and unleashed a broadside that tore the Ranger apart. The crew surrendered within hours. 2 days later, Ogle came back for Roberts himself. On the morning of the 10th of February 1722, HMS Swallow bore down on the Royal Fortune. Roberts could have run. He probably should have run. But Bartholomew Roberts had never run from a fight in his life, and he wasn't about to start now. Roberts dressed for battle in his finest crimson coat, put on his diamond cross, and ordered his crew to engage. The first broadside from the Swallow hit the Royal Fortune hard, and in the opening minutes of the battle, a blast of grape shot caught Bartholomew Roberts directly in the throat. He died almost instantly, slumped over a cannon. His crew, following his standing orders, wrapped his body in chains and threw him overboard before the Navy could take it. Bartholomew Roberts' body was never recovered. The most successful pirate of the Golden Age sank into the Atlantic, and the sea kept him. Without their captain, the crew of the Royal Fortune fell apart. They surrendered within hours. Ogle took 272 pirates prisoner and sailed them to Cape Coast Castle on the Gold Coast for trial. It was the largest pirate trial in history. 54 men were hanged. Another 37 were sentenced to penal servitude in the mines. The rest received prison sentences or were acquitted. Captain Challoner Ogle became the only Royal Navy officer in history to be knighted specifically for defeating pirates. He earned it. Roberts' death in 1722 is the moment most historians point to as the true end of the Golden Age of Piracy. Not because there were no more pirates after that. There were, but the great captains, the ones who commanded fleets and terrorized entire coastlines, were gone. Blackbeard, dead. Vane, hanged. Rackham, hanged. Bonnet, hanged. Roberts, dead. The age of the pirate king was over, and it was the warship that killed it. Not any single warship, not any single battle. It was what the warship represented, the full weight of an empire deciding that piracy was no longer acceptable. When the British Crown committed real naval resources to the problem, the pirates never stood a chance. They were fast, they were clever, they were brave, and none of that mattered against a 50-gun man-of-war with 200 trained sailors and enough cannonballs to level a small town. The pirates had thrived in the gaps between wars when trained sailors had no work, the gaps in naval coverage when warships were fighting in European waters instead of patrolling the Caribbean, the gaps in governance when colonial administrators were too corrupt or too weak to enforce the law. When those gaps closed, piracy died. Rogers took Nassau and closed the safe harbor gap. The King's pardon split the pirate community and closed the recruitment gap. And the warships, HMS Milford, HMS Rose, HMS Pearl, HMS Scarborough, HMS Swallow, closed the firepower gap permanently. There's something almost tragic about it, depending on how you look at it. The pirates of the Golden Age were, in many cases, working men who'd been used by empires during wartime and discarded when the fighting stopped. They built their own society in the Bahamas. They wrote their own laws. They elected their own leaders. In a world of kings and colonies, they chose freedom, even if that freedom came with a noose at the end. But freedom doesn't win against a 50-gun frigate. It never has. The last governor of the Pirate Republic was Woodes Rogers, a man who understood pirates because he'd lived like one. The last great pirate was Bartholomew Roberts, a man who dressed like a king and fought like a devil. And the instrument that ended them both was the same: a warship, a floating giant, a weapon so overwhelming that it didn't just defeat the pirates. It made piracy itself obsolete. After 1722, the Caribbean was never the same. The shipping lanes were patrolled by permanent naval squadrons stationed at Jamaica, Barbados, and Antigua. The harbors were governed. The trade routes were protected by regular convoy escorts. Insurance rates dropped. Merchant captains stopped arming their crews because they didn't need to anymore. Port Royal, once the wickedest city on earth, became a quiet naval base. Nassau became a respectable colonial capital. The Royal Navy had turned the most dangerous ocean in the world into a British lake, and they intended to keep it that way. There would be pirates again, of course. There always are. Piracy never truly disappeared from the world's oceans, but never again like this. Never an entire generation of men who sailed under their own flag, answered to no king, elected their own captains, divided their plunder by vote, and for a brief, chaotic, bloody moment in history made the greatest empire on earth, afraid of what was hiding in the water. The warships put an end to that, not with one battle, with a campaign, a slow, grinding, relentless campaign that hunted down every last captain, burned every last pirate sloop, and hanged every last man who refused to give up the black flag. The Golden Age of Piracy didn't fade away. It was killed, systematically, deliberately, methodically. And the weapon that killed it is still sitting in the history books, preserved in oil paintings and ship models and admiralty records and the rotting timbers of wrecks on the ocean floor. The warship, the floating giant, the end of an era.